Most people look at a Samsung screen and just see smooth colors, deep blacks, and sharp brightness. A phone display, a TV, something normal, nothing to think too deeply about. But that reaction only exists because the screen is doing its job perfectly. Because the moment you look slightly closer, the question stops being, "Why does this look good?" and becomes something more uncomfortable. How does something this thin, this flat, this cheap compared to its performance look better than cinema displays used to look just a few years ago? And here's where the first misconception starts to break. A screen is not a single piece of technology. It is a stack of decisions, material choices, light behavior, electrical control, manufacturing precision, and calibration systems, all layered together so tightly that the final product feels simple. But inside Samsung's display systems, nothing about it is simple, not even close. To understand what's happening, you have to start with the part most people never think about, the pixels themselves. Modern Samsung displays, especially OLED panels, don't work like traditional screens, where a backlight shines through filters. Each pixel produces its own light. That sounds like a small upgrade on paper, but in reality, it changes everything. Because now, instead of controlling a single light source behind the display, you are controlling millions of microscopic light sources individually, each one turning on and off with extreme precision. And this is where the first hidden layer appears. If even a small number of those pixels are slightly inconsistent in brightness, color, or response time, the entire illusion breaks. You don't see a screen anymore. You see uneven light behavior. So Samsung doesn't just manufacture displays, it manufactures consistency at a microscopic level. That consistency is the real product. But there is a question that naturally comes next. If every pixel is its own light source, why don't these screens look chaotic? Why don't colors shift randomly or degrade instantly over time? This is where things start to get more uncomfortable. Because controlling millions of individual light emitters is not just a hardware problem, it's a constant correction problem. Every pixel ages slightly differently. Every pixel responds slightly differently. So the screen is always compensating. Constant recalibration is happening in the background, adjusting brightness and color output, so the display still looks uniform to your eyes, even when the underlying components are slowly changing. So what you see as a stable image is actually a controlled illusion of stability. And this is only the beginning layer, because the real advantage Samsung has is not just in how the pixels work, but in how precisely they can be manufactured at scale. Making one perfect screen in a lab is not impressive. Making millions of them, where each one behaves almost identically, is where things get difficult. This is where manufacturing stops being production and starts becoming control over probability. At this scale, tiny imperfections become unavoidable. Subtle variations in materials, microscopic inconsistencies in layers, slight deviations in alignment. In most industries, these would be acceptable. In display technology, they become visible immediately. A slightly off color tone in one corner of a screen is enough to ruin the entire product. So the system has to correct for variation before the user ever sees it. And that's where the deeper story begins to emerge. Because what Samsung is really doing is not just building screens, it is building a process that forces reality into consistency at industrial scale.
And that idea becomes even more important when you realize something most people never consider. A display factory is not trying to make perfect screens. It is trying to make indistinguishable screens. Because perfection in manufacturing is unstable. It changes from unit to unit. What matters more is uniformity. If one screen looks slightly different from another, even if both are technically good, the illusion of quality breaks at the consumer level. So Samsung's real advantage starts to show here. It isn't just the materials or the OLED structure. It's the control systems layered on top of production. Every stage of manufacturing is measured, adjusted, and corrected in real time, not after the fact, during the process itself. Layers are deposited at atomic-level thickness ranges, where even tiny variations can change brightness or lifespan. And instead of accepting those variations, the system actively compensates for them as they happen. This is where it stops being normal engineering and starts feeling more like controlled physics. Because at this level, you are no longer building screens, you are guiding material behavior so that randomness never gets a chance to fully appear in the final product. And here's where things get a bit more interesting. Even after the screens are manufactured, they're not truly finished. Each panel is tested, measured, and assigned correction profiles. That means two screens coming off the same production line are not necessarily identical in how they're driven. Each one has its own calibration map, adjusting how it responds to brightness and color input so that it matches a target standard. So what the user sees is not raw output. It is corrected output, filtered through layers of compensation that exist specifically to hide the imperfections that would otherwise be visible at scale. At this point, something subtle starts to become clear. The quality of Samsung screens is not just about how advanced the technology is. It's about how aggressively the system hides its own complexity from you. And that raises a question that engineers quietly deal with but rarely talk about publicly. If so much correction is happening behind the scenes just to maintain consistency, how far is the display from what it was physically meant to be? Because the deeper you go, the more the screen stops looking like a simple output device and starts looking like a negotiated result between physics, manufacturing limits, and constant digital correction. But even that is not the full picture. There is one more layer that explains why Samsung specifically dominates this space while others struggle to catch up. And it has less to do with the screens themselves and more to do with how early control over the entire production chain changes what is even possible in the final product. That's where the real separation begins.
And this is where everything quietly shifts. Because once you understand how much correction, calibration, and compensation is happening behind the scenes, the definition of a good screen stops being obvious. It's not just brightness anymore. It's not just color accuracy. It hides the fact that it is constantly wrong at a microscopic level. Every pixel, every layer, every material in that display is drifting slightly away from perfection at all times. Temperature changes it. Age changes it. Electrical stress changes it. Even time itself changes how it behaves. Nothing about it is truly stable. So the only reason the image looks stable is because something else is constantly correcting it. And that's the part most people never mentally process. Because your eyes are not seeing a perfect panel. They are seeing the end result of thousands of micro-adjustments happening every second, all designed to cancel out the imperfections you were never meant to notice. At this point, the screen stops feeling like a product. It starts feeling like a negotiation between physics and control systems. But there is still one final layer that explains why Samsung is not just part of the display industry, but effectively shaping it. Because when you control the most widely used high-end display pipeline in the world, you don't just improve screens, you define what good means for everyone else trying to compete. Every competitor is forced to measure against a standard that Samsung already stabilized at scale. And that creates a silent gap that is not just about engineering difficulty, but about industrial timing, supply chain control, and accumulated manufacturing precision that takes years to replicate. So, even when other companies produce good displays, they are not really competing in the same space anymore. They are competing against a moving target that already solved most of the hard problems at scale. And that brings everything back to the same uncomfortable realization. What you call a high-quality screen is not a simple achievement. It is the result of controlling variability so tightly that imperfection stops being visible. And the more you understand what is happening underneath it, the more the illusion stabilizes in front of your eyes, even though nothing about the underlying system is actually simple. The screen doesn't look good because reality became simple. It looks good because complexity was mastered well enough to disappear. And that is the real advantage. Not brightness, not color, not resolution. Control over what you are allowed to notice.